Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring one of the most haunting cold cases in British criminal history. Two victims, two murders, 6 months apart, on opposite sides of one of the world's greatest cities. And a single, unidentified killer who has never been brought to justice. The question that has lingered for nearly 5 decades is this: who is the man whose DNA connects both of these crimes, and why has he never been found? Here's what happened. She works at one of the most famous and glamorous night spots in the world, the Playboy Club on Park Lane, where she is employed as a bunny girl, one of the iconic figures of that era's entertainment industry. She has her whole life ahead of her. And then, on the morning of the 18th of March, 1975, everything changes. Eve is found murdered at her flat in Leyton, in East London. She is 21 years old. And one man, somewhere out there, who has never answered for what he did. Despite the existence of that DNA profile, despite decades of police appeals, despite a reward being offered for information leading to identification, that man has never been named. His profile has never been matched to any individual on the UK National DNA Database. He may still be alive today. This is the story of Eve Stratford and Lynne Weedon. This is an exploration of the evidence, the investigation, the DNA breakthrough that changed everything, and a theory about what this case may tell us about the man responsible. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. It attracted celebrities, business people, politicians, and wealthy clientele from around the globe. The bunny girls who worked there were selected for their appearance and their professionalism. They were a symbol of a particular kind of glamour that defined parts of London in that era. Eve lived in a flat in Leyton, East London. Leyton, for those who are not familiar with London's geography, sits in what was then a largely working-class part of the city, part of the East End's extended reach. It is a community of terraced houses and busy roads, a very different world from the glittering Park Lane venue where Eve worked her shifts. That contrast, between the world Eve moved in professionally and the neighborhood where she made her home, is an important piece of context as we think about how she came to be a victim. On the 18th of March, 1975, Eve Stratford was found murdered at her flat. The Metropolitan Police investigated. The case attracted significant media attention at the time, partly because of Eve's high-profile employment at the Playboy Club, which inevitably drew public interest. Investigators worked the case. They looked into her life, her connections, the people she knew through her work at the club, the people she knew in her neighborhood. But despite their efforts, no arrest was made. No one was charged. The case went cold. What investigators had in 1975 were witness statements, physical evidence that could be examined through the technologies of the time, and the work of experienced detectives who knew their communities. When a case went cold in 1975, it did not mean the evidence was gone. It meant the evidence was waiting. It meant that biological material that had been carefully collected and preserved might, one day, yield answers that were simply not possible to extract at the time. And that is exactly what happened here. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us talk about Lynne Weedon. Lynne Weedon was 16 years old. She was a schoolgirl, living in Hounslow in West London. Hounslow, again for context, sits in the western suburbs of the city, a very different geography from Leyton. If you draw a line across a map of London, you are looking at perhaps 15 to 20 miles between these two locations, through the heart of one of the most densely populated cities in Europe. On the 3rd of September, 1975, Lynne Weedon was walking home in Hounslow when she was attacked. Biological material that was collected at crime scenes decades ago, material that was scientifically useless at the time of collection, can now be analyzed to produce detailed genetic profiles. In 2007, following such a review, the Metropolitan Police made a public announcement that would change the nature of both investigations permanently. According to BBC News Archive reports covering the announcement, DNA evidence recovered from both the crime scene associated with the murder of Eve Stratford and the crime scene associated with the attack on Lynne Weedon had been subjected to modern analysis. The results were unambiguous. The DNA profiles obtained from both scenes matched each other. They belonged to the same unidentified male. A connection that no one had been able to establish for 32 years was suddenly, definitively proven by science. Now here is where the frustration deepens. The DNA profile, this unambiguous biological fingerprint that places an unidentified man at both scenes, was run against the UK National DNA Database. And it matched nothing. Nobody. The man whose genetic material was found at both crime scenes had never, as far as the database was concerned, had his DNA collected and stored. He had not, as of 2007, been arrested for any offense that resulted in a DNA sample being taken. He was not on the database. There have been multiple anniversary appeals over the years, significant moments when the cases were brought back into public consciousness in the hope that someone, somewhere, would come forward with information that would allow that DNA profile to be matched to a real human being with a real name. As of the time of this video's production, no such match has been made. Both cases remain officially unsolved. The man whose DNA connects these two murders has never been identified through the National DNA Database. He may still be out there. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure we have established the full picture of what we actually know, and what we do not know, because the distinction matters enormously in a case like this. What we know, based entirely on public records, official police statements, and reporting from sources including the BBC News Archive and The Guardian, is this. Eve Stratford was murdered on the 18th of March, 1975, at her flat in Leyton, East London. She was 21 years old. She was employed as a bunny girl at the Playboy Club on Park Lane. Her case was investigated at the time but no arrest was made. Lynne Weedon was attacked on the 3rd of September, 1975, while walking home in Hounslow, West London. She was 16 years old and a schoolgirl. She died from her injuries approximately 1 week after the attack. Her case was also investigated at the time but no arrest was made. In 2007, the Metropolitan Police announced that modern DNA analysis had established a link between both crimes, confirming that the same unidentified male was responsible for both. That DNA profile has not been matched to anyone on the UK National DNA Database. The cases are periodically reviewed by the Metropolitan Police's Cold Case Unit. A reward has been offered for information. Multiple public appeals have been made. That is what we know for certain. What we do not know is the identity of the offender, his motive, his background, or any specific details about his connection to either victim or either location beyond what the DNA evidence establishes. Does that suggest he was careful, that he lived his life in a way that never brought him into contact with the criminal justice system after 1975? Does it suggest he died before the database could ever have captured his profile? Does it suggest he left the country? Or does it suggest something else entirely? Drop your theory in the comments. I mean that genuinely, because this question is at the heart of why this case remains unsolved. Let me now walk you through my theory. And I want to be clear about what this is. This is an analytical framework built entirely on publicly available information. It is not an accusation against any living person. It is an attempt to use the facts as we have them to construct a logical picture of who this man might have been and where his story might have led. Every element of what I am about to present is grounded in the public record. Because geography is one of the most revealing things about an offender's pattern of behavior. Leyton in the east, Hounslow in the west, 6 months apart, that is a remarkable spread across a very large city. Let me paint the picture more concretely. Leyton is in the London borough of Waltham Forest. In 1975, it was a community characterized by Victorian and Edwardian terraced housing, a working class and lower middle class demographic, relatively tight-knit communities, and the kind of urban environment where people generally knew their neighbors. It sits to the northeast of the City of London, across the River Lee, in what would now be considered inner East London. Hounslow is something entirely different. It sits to the west, beyond the reach of what most people would think of as inner London, closer to the M4 motorway corridor, to Heathrow Airport, to the Thames Valley. In 1975, Hounslow was a suburban community with its own distinct character. A mixture of residential streets and industrial areas, shaped in part by its proximity to the airport and the employment that came with it. Either the offender had legitimate reasons to move between different parts of London as a regular feature of his life, reasons connected to his work, his social world, or his personal circumstances. Or he deliberately ranged across the city in a way that was calculated to avoid creating a recognizable geographic pattern close to any one community where he might be known. Both of those possibilities are significant. Let us explore them. The point is that a man who moved between East and West London as a function of his normal life would have had a mental map of the city that extended far beyond his own immediate neighborhood. He would have known Leyton and known Hounslow not as foreign territories but as places he visited regularly. This matters because it affects our understanding of his knowledge of these specific locations. If he committed both crimes in places he knew well through regular visits, that suggests a level of operational familiarity. He would have known the streets, the rhythms of the local community, the times when certain areas were quiet. That is not knowledge you acquire casually. It is knowledge you build up over time through repeated exposure. This speaks to a different kind of offender, someone who was thinking about consequences, who understood that crimes committed too close to home create risks, who deliberately sought out locations removed from his own community. In criminological terms, this kind of geographic displacement is associated with a more organized, calculating type of offender. Someone who thought about what he was doing. Both of these profiles are compatible with the fact that this man was never caught, never identified, and has never appeared on the national DNA database. A man who was careful. A man who understood, on some level, what he was doing and what its consequences might be. She lived independently in her own flat. She moved in circles that included, by virtue of her employment, wealthy and well-connected people. She was an adult navigating the city on her own terms. Lynne Weedon was 16 years old. She was a schoolgirl. She was attacked while walking home. She was, in the most literal sense, a child going about a routine, everyday activity. What I am interested in is what the offender's choices, as revealed by the publicly available evidence, tell us about who he was. Because understanding his choices is the only pathway to understanding his identity. The fact that his two known victims were a 21-year-old woman living independently in East London and a 16-year-old schoolgirl walking home in West London does not, on the surface, suggest a single obvious victim type. It does not suggest someone who was targeting a specific demographic or social group in the way that some serial offenders demonstrably do. What it might suggest, and this is where my theory develops, is that the primary driver of his behavior was opportunity, combined with some level of geographic range that exposed him to both of these situations. That suggests the offender had access to her home environment, either because he had been invited in, because he had followed her to her residence, or because he had knowledge of where she lived that he had acquired through some prior contact or observation. Lynne Weedon was attacked while walking home. That suggests an attack in an external environment, in a public space, at a time when a young girl was alone and vulnerable on the street. These are two different kinds of opportunity. One involves access to a private residence. One involves an encounter in a public space. The fact that the same man was responsible for both suggests flexibility and adaptability in his approach. He was not locked into one method or one type of situation. He could function across different scenarios. He was someone who could identify and act on different types of opportunity in different environments. That speaks to a certain kind of social intelligence, a capacity to read situations and exploit them. It also speaks to a level of boldness that is genuinely chilling when you sit with it. Now let me talk about timing, because timing is another critical element that the public record gives us to work with. The murders are separated by approximately 6 months. March 1975 to September 1975. What happened in those 6 months? That is a question the police have never been able to answer publicly, because the offender has never been identified. But it is a question worth asking. A longer interval might suggest an offender whose behavior is more calculated, who waits, who perhaps has significant periods of what criminologists call normal functioning, living what appears to be an entirely ordinary life in the spaces between offending. 6 months is a meaningful interval. It is long enough to suggest that whatever drove this man's behavior was not constant, overwhelming compulsion that demanded immediate re-expression. It is long enough to suggest someone who, for 6 months after March 1975, lived among other people in an apparently ordinary way. He went to work, he interacted with his community, he moved through the world, and then, in September 1975, he encountered Lynne Weedon in Hounslow. Someone's family member. He existed in a social world, had relationships, probably had people who trusted him and liked him and had no idea what he was capable of. That is one of the hardest things to comprehend about cases like this. But it is one of the most important things to understand, because it is why these cases are so difficult to solve. It contains, according to publicly available government statistics, profiles of individuals who have been arrested for recordable offenses in England and Wales. By the time the Metropolitan Police were running their cold case review in the mid-2000s, the database contained millions of profiles. The fact that the offender's profile was not on the database in 2007 tells us one of several things. It might mean that he had never been arrested for any offense in England and Wales since 1995, the year the database was established. That is possible. He might have lived a life entirely free of contact with the criminal justice system in the decade between 1995 and the 2007 announcement. He might have committed these 2 crimes in 1975 and never offended again, at least not in ways that brought him to police attention. If he was, say, in his 20s or 30s in 1975, he would have been born in the late 1930s, the 1940s, or the early 1950s. A man born in the 1940s who was active as an offender in 1975 would have been in his late 70s or older by the time this video is being made. A man born in the late 1930s could easily have died in the years since 1975 without ever having had his DNA taken. This is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of cold cases that involve a DNA profile without a match. The database can only tell you about the people who are on it. It cannot tell you about the people who never entered the criminal justice system, who died before sampling became routine, or who for whatever reason simply never left a DNA sample in a context where it was captured and stored. In 1975, Britain was a very different country in terms of population movement and the ease of international travel. But people did emigrate. People did move abroad for work, for family, for any number of reasons. If this man left the United Kingdom sometime after 1975, his DNA would not appear on the UK National DNA Database regardless of anything that might have happened to him in another country. The geographic range he demonstrated, East London in March, West London in September, suggests either a life or a routine that took him across the city. He had enough knowledge of both Leyton and Hounslow to identify opportunities in those communities. He was bold enough to act on those opportunities. And after September 1975, as far as the public record tells us, he was never formally linked to another crime. That last point deserves emphasis. As far as we know from public records and official police statements, the Metropolitan Police have not publicly linked this DNA profile to any other offenses beyond the murders of Eve Stratford and Lynne Weedon. Whether that means he truly stopped offending after September 1975, whether it means any subsequent offenses were not detected or not linked, or whether it reflects the limitations of the evidence available to investigators, we simply cannot say with certainty. But the public record gives us 2 confirmed crimes and no others. Or, and this is a more uncomfortable thought, he might still be alive and living in the United Kingdom, having simply never been caught, never been arrested for anything that generated a DNA sample, and carrying the knowledge of what he did in 1975 through an entire lifetime. Would you focus on the human intelligence angle, renewed appeals directed at specific communities in the Leyton and Hounslow areas? Or would you take a different approach entirely? Tell me in the comments, because I think this is a conversation worth having. That is something investigators considered at the time, and as far as the public record tells us, no connection to her specific employment environment was established that led to an arrest or a prosecution. That remains the official position. That reward is a meaningful incentive, but I think the more powerful incentive for anyone who holds information is this. 2 families have been waiting for nearly 50 years. 2 young women were murdered by the same man, and that man has never been held accountable for what he did. Let me now turn to the broader lessons of this case, because I think there are things this investigation tells us about crime, about forensic science, and about the passage of time that extend beyond the specific facts of what happened in 1975. They could not have known that the samples they were collecting would, 30 years later, prove to be the most important evidence in the case. They did their jobs carefully, and because they did, the possibility of justice still exists. This is an important message for investigators working today. Evidence collected now may yield results that are not currently possible through technologies that do not yet exist. The standard of evidence preservation matters enormously, and it is a lesson this case illustrates powerfully. Those gaps mean that for some cases, the database will never produce the answer on its own. The human intelligence component, the witness, the family member, the person carrying a piece of information they do not yet know is crucial, remains irreplaceable. I believe the man responsible for these 2 murders was someone who, in the spring and autumn of 1975, was living what appeared to others to be a relatively normal life. I believe he had some legitimate reason to know and move through different parts of London, whether that was employment, family connections, or something else. I believe he was not someone who was obviously dangerous or overtly criminal in his day-to-day presentation to the world, because the evidence suggests he was never caught, never formally identified, and, as far as the public record tells us, never officially suspected in the years following these crimes. I believe he may have died without ever being held accountable. But I also believe it is possible that someone who knew him in 1975, someone who is still alive today, is carrying information that they may not fully have processed as relevant. A name, a memory, a behavior, something that sat in the back of their mind for decades and occasionally resurfaces. It has been on file for over 15 years. It has never been matched to any individual on the UK National DNA Database. Both cases remain officially unsolved. The Metropolitan Police continues to review them. A reward for information leading to identification of the offender has been publicly offered. Their cold case unit takes all information seriously, and any piece of information, no matter how small it might seem, could be the detail that finally puts a name to that DNA profile. The families of Eve Stratford and Lynne Weedon are waiting. The Metropolitan Police are waiting. And whoever this man is, wherever his story ended, the truth about what he did in 1975 deserves to be known. I read every single comment on this channel, and on a case like this one, the collective thinking of this community genuinely matters. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news.